And we'll start with the very first sort of week of course material, not including the first week, which focused on the history of youth. So not just youth offending, but how youth were viewed by society. We'll trace the course of different perspectives on youth at different eras, beginning in the Middle Ages in medieval Europe, when it was the perspective that there was really no such thing as a youth. Children and youth were viewed just as miniature adults. There was no separation of stages of the life course. The perspective of the time was that children were born evil, and this was linked to original sin. The Catholic Church dominated the judicial system through this hegemonic approach, which means they controlled basically the public's access to information. And this was why the predominant explanation of crime at the time was demonic possession. There were no real theories of crime. If children are born evil and if people are involved in crime, it must be related to the devil's doing. Following from the medieval period, there were some key stages in between, but another key stage that emerged in the 18th century was the Enlightenment, because we began to see a decline in the sort of stranglehold on the judicial system by the church. Greek and Roman thought begins to spread. New ideas emerge that sort of are separate or distinct from religious themes. And these ideas get spread through trade. So the idea of trade wasn't to spread new ideas. The idea of trade was to get new things, to make money, to establish different industries. It wasn't just about farming of land. But the result of this trade in physical goods also resulted in the trade of non-tangible goods, specifically ideas. And we began to see new conceptions of childhood. They were more humane, believing that kids had certain rights or needs. And so there's this increasing focus on science over religion. In Canada, when we get to the Industrial Revolution, we begin to see some serious consequences for children. Families are deserted, or children are brought over from Europe on their own to work, and they're taken advantage of by employers, or they get to Canada and they find that there is no work. This created an industry of prostitution. There were very poor social conditions, and there was no real social safety net, which resulted in a decrease in legal rights for young persons, or at least the legal rights for young persons were much poorer when held against adults. Many reformers of the time, reformers wanting to see changes in the law, saw causes of youth crime and immorality as lying in social welfare problems that resulted from a loss of agrarian roots. So here's where we see like that our generation was never this bad perspective, the belief that there's something wrong with the kids of today. And the loss of agrarian roots was speaking to the idea that kids were no longer being monitored as much. They were no longer engaging in things like apprenticeships. They were either working in factories where they were left on their own to sort of work these particular machines, or they didn't have a job, and so they were out begging in the streets. Looking back, before even ideas of Canada were alive, there was early perspectives on youth justice. Not to say that there were distinct youth justice systems. In fact, pre-Enlightenment, there was no idea of youth or children as a distinct age stage. Children were just treated as miniature adults, as I mentioned, so there was no need to even think of a separate justice system. But over time, we began to see, especially through trade from Italy, or what was then Rome, where the notion of patria potestas, the idea that the father had absolute control and children were their possession. So now this idea of child becomes a thing. It's not necessarily a good thing because we're looking at children as possessions as opposed to human beings. But now they're thinking about youth differently, that at least it's something for the parents to consider, or more specifically, the father to consider. And over time, we saw sort of an improved understanding of the idea, well, what happens if a child is an orphan? Or what if the parents cannot take care of the child? Well, the king is supposed to be the father of the country, this idea of parens patriae. So the court would then take responsibility for the child if the parents and other family members are deemed unfit, but still there's no distinct youth justice system. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the perspective of youth crime during agrarian society was that the fur trade was largely responsible for why youth were engaging in crime. And the fur trade had two sort of themes that were influencing crime. One was that it exposed youth to adulthood, and one was that it gave youth too much freedom. So just to reiterate, in terms of like how these different eras viewed crime in medieval Europe around the 6th to 7th century, original sin was viewed as the cause of crime, and the Catholic Church kind of was the justice system. Then we see from the 14th to 16th century a movement away from serfdom. So there's no longer a group of people living on a particular plot of land owned by a king or something like that. There's now individuals are farming their own land, and it's a subsistence-based culture where people are farming what they need to eat for themselves. And the church is still really important, but the church isn't the justice system. These are separate factors or separate systems. When we get to the 17th and 18th century, we begin to see capitalism as a concept emerge. And this concept emerged from another thing that was called mercantilism. Mercantilism was where, especially when we saw England, for example, but it was also like the Dutch, Spanish, would colonize different areas, and they would put one particular company responsible for mining in that particular new colony. And there would be a dedicated company. It wasn't necessarily the state that would be responsible for bringing all of the gold back to England, for example, or back to Spain. And so during this time, because there was this trade and exchanging of ideas, we saw new perspectives on the causes of youth crime. When we got to the 19th and 20th century, we begin to see the Industrial Revolution, where there's a separation of youth and adults in terms of youth being a distinct developmental stage. But unfortunately, during this time, we saw severely poor working conditions, and that led to the child savers movement.